I take you now to Joe Banister joining us. And his website is agentfortruth.com. It's an excellent website. He's also an author. But just looking at this, I have the New York Times here that we'll put on screen because I can't find it, admitting the IRS takes tens of thousands of people's businesses and accounts with no proof of fraud. And even the New York Times admits it. They have congressional hearings. Law lets IRS seize accounts on suspicion. No crime required. And then Joe Banister speaks out against this, and they try to put him in prison. This is a totalitarian move. But how can you believe anything the system says when the DEA for decades has been recording and tracking basically every phone call and lying about it? Joe Banister, thanks for coming on. I kind of set the table there with a background of this persecution. And now Lois Lerner, the DOJ, says no contempt charges for former IRS official Lois Lerner. She gets to persecute tens of thousands of people, wrecking their lives, causing suicides, imprisoning people. These are the type of folks that came after you. They're allowed to commit their crimes out in the open, Joe Banister. What do you make of that?
Well, thanks for having me on, Alex. It's been a while, huh? 16 years since we met in that Chinese restaurant in Fremont, California, when you were doing the police state investigation. The hole is very deep. You're right. I mean, I was tired of it a long time ago, as were you, where heads never roll. Lois Lerner, I mean, right at the tip top, of course, Obama and the commissioner of the IRS would be above her, and they're ultimately allowing this to go on. But even someone like Lerner and all of the underlings that she was ordering around, no heads roll. They get their retirements, they get their pensions, their paychecks.
I want to know how they themselves can persecute even mainline pro-life and libertarian groups and try to put people in prison or deny their 501c3. I mean, they're just such conscious persecutors. They're such conscious crooks.
Well, I mean, brimming with evil. And again, all I can do, and you do so well, and so much wider than me, is to try to continue to bang the drum and get the American people in much greater numbers to be sick and tired of being treated like chumps. And you remind people of this so frequently, and well,
let's go back and talk about, just briefly before we look at the current crimes and where you see the world going, because you're a smart guy. I want to get your take on this. You have a lot of family that's in law enforcement. I want to get, basically what they're saying now, because you told me previously they used to think you were wrong. Now they're, you've said are pretty freaked out as well. And that's the same thing I get from other folks that I know as well that are in the enforcement system. They now are having that moment of truth, like the military, realizing how real all this really is. The denial's over. Now is the moment of truth. But describe for folks what they tried to do to you for simply speaking out about what they were doing.
Well, in a nutshell, Alex, I had some clients after I left the IRS, and frankly, the clients dragged me into dealing with the IRS on their behalf. And I really wanted nothing to do with the IRS, but a particular client wanted to sue the IRS to get his tax money back. So he had already paid the IRS the money. The IRS lays out instructions, procedures to follow if you want to get your money back. And so the client asked me to help him dot all the I's and cross all the T's to make sure that he followed the rules to just try to get his money back. Now, of course, the IRS, there's a civil process that goes on as you try to do that. And the IRS can simply say no, and then you appeal to higher and higher levels. And that's the way it's supposed to work. That's the way their manuals say it's supposed to work. That's the way the courts say it's supposed to work. But what the IRS did is they turned that process, the client trying to seek a refund and using a CPA to help him follow the instructions, they turned that into a criminal activity whereby we were fraudulently seeking a refund. And it's very typical that the IRS will do this to people. They'll pull out the criminal prosecution card, the specter of you being a criminal, in order to silence and discredit you. And unfortunately, there's a fortunate and unfortunate part about this. You have to be charged criminally in order for you to get a jury of your peers to actually evaluate your conduct. Most of what the IRS does, they do civilly, and there's no jury involved, rarely a judge involved, and so they can, unilaterally do all the evil that they do. But when you're charged criminally, you still have an opportunity for a jury trial. And I had a jury trial in Sacramento, California. We were a little concerned because the majority of the jury pool came from government service. Sacramento, California is the capital of California, brimming with government bureaucrats. And we had quite a few government servants on the jury, and yet they were the ones that were the most awake. So you never know how you're going to be surprised. And so June of 2005, fighting 4 felony counts that would have sent me to Club Fed for quite a few years, I was acquitted of all the charges, and deservedly so, because the jury saw the most ridiculous allegations. And then when we got to trial, the government had no case. A couple of the jurors told me after the trial, they said, well, Joe, every time the government brought something up, it actually made you look better. Aren't they supposed to bring up stuff that makes you look bad? And I said, well, I didn't have anything that made me look bad, and they couldn't even manufacture anything.
But then they came after you again.
Right. There were immediately after my acquittal, they started this 6.5-year civil investigation. And of course, most of the civil investigations that they do are really just veiled criminal investigations where they gather up as much information as they can on someone and look for any possible angle to prosecute them criminally. So, it's been ongoing. I resigned to the fact. I resigned in 1999 from the IRS, but resigned to the fact at that point that I'd probably be dancing with the IRS for the rest of my life. So I'm kind of getting what I already expected, and thankfully I'm still very appreciative of the rights that do remain that we can still take advantage of.
Well, sure, a lot of people will say, this sounds scary, I better submit to them, but they go after people that go along with the system. Then meanwhile, upwards of half of Congress doesn't pay taxes or owes taxes, mainly Democrats. They then don't get in trouble. Al Sharpton can owe millions of dollars, never pay it. All the big billionaires have the laws written, and the special accounting firms. And I've had the CPAs and top lawyers tell me, Alex, you're not an insider. You're not allowed to have these tax exemptions and these, the Irish shuffle and all these other things they do that are legal. But the way the IRS interprets it, I can't do it with a little bit of money. But if you've got billions and you're part of the establishment, then you can. And that's what's so frustrating. I'm sure you saw the New York Times article and the congressional hearings a few months ago where they just admitted, okay, the IRS does take innocent people's money. They know they're innocent. Old ladies that deposit, from their small diners, $600, $700 a day, pay taxes on it. They now call that criminal, even though it's not criminal, and take everything the old ladies got. I mean, this is just wild. And then now we see asset forfeiture seizure through the feds and local police expanding. I mean, it's getting so naked. Is it getting worse, or are we just more aware of it now?
I think both. Frankly, in the 80s is when all the money laundering laws, the structuring laws, it all became, had a lot more power and teeth. It was actually in the 80s that the IRS special agents were enabled to carry their firearms 24/7. It used to be, prior to the 80s, that they'd have to check their gun out of a safe. They rarely would actually carry their gun with them. So the money laundering laws, these structuring laws, all these laws that are tripping up the average American, this is something you speak about so frequently, problem, reaction, solution. They tell the public that, we have to go after these drug dealers and get all these money laundering laws. And sure, they could choke up the money launderers and the drug dealers if they wanted to.
But they don't.
But they actually want to use these measures to spy on the American people. And the financial spying was some of the, the earliest spying that they did. I mean, the structuring laws come from the Bank Secrecy Act, right, of 1970. So the planning occurs many decades ahead of time, and sadly, we collectively as Americans, we keep getting boondoggled that oh, the target of this is really these bad drug dealers. And I found when I was doing my investigations in the IRS that, wow, why is it that all these bad drug dealers, we may pick off 1 out of 1,000, but meanwhile, millions of Americans, every cash transaction that they do is being monitored.
Well, sure, you've seen the regulations change where they've gotten rid of most of the white-collar armed investigators like you that would go after corrupt billionaires, and the headlines are, more IRS investigators target blue-collar. I mean, they'll do some $50,000 investigation over $1,000 of some blue-collar guy that can barely pay his bills because they don't want the investigators going after the real criminals. They want them going after the general public. Joe Banister, a true American hero, is our guest. We have guests we get on from prison who are then banned to talking to the outside world. That just happened last week. I mean, folks, this is what happens in totalitarian countries. And people just have a different perspective than I, because they hear me talking about the IRS and all the stuff that's happening. I think, man, this guy's trying to scare us to go along with the government. And some people think that's why they leave me alone. The government thinks you're cowards and just thinks that I'm up here telling you all this and you're just going to roll over in fear. That's not how it works. Let's say 95% of the public rolls over in fear and 5% doesn't. It's way above that. The globalists can't carry this out if we don't go along with it. They need compliance. We need to stop complying like Joe Banister did. Not be complicit and aid and abet open criminal activity. I like the younger Le Pen over in France. And we're going back to our guests and your calls. But her dad came out, I think almost to sabotage her, and endorsed the Vichy French occupation with the Nazis of World War II. France stood down and let the Nazis take over. They didn't fight the Germans. Hitler was there 4 days after the invasion in Paris. Maybe 5%, halfway stood up, and Hitler could barely beat the French. And the French, who'd conquered much of the world and were known as one of the most warlike, aggressive people, got a wimp reputation after that point that isn't even real. What we have here is a foreign corporate takeover of our government, and you see it happening all over the world. Folks, this is illegitimate. It should be so easy to say no. And, I know I'm ranting here, Joe Banister, former Treasury agent who went public with all this information 16 years ago and has been persecuted but come out of it stronger. I think what I'm trying to get at is people ask why I'm so animated. It's because I realize how real this is. You realize how real this is. And then I want to just give you the floor to cover other IRS topics and some of the good news. I know you sent me an email about some of the positive things, and then I want to take some phone calls. It'll be all over the map.
Thanks. As you correctly point out, part of the reason that we get so animated about this is because we actually pay attention to the people that are suffering. Not only millions of Americans getting their bank accounts seized and liens put on their homes and financially devastated, but then those people who actually speak up about the IRS and about why we have an income tax. Where did it come from? It's the darling of Karl Marx, not Thomas Jefferson. But the suffering that goes on, as Kent Hovind, you had him on your show a few weeks ago. Erwin Schiff, another thing you illustrated is how you never know how they're going to attack you. With you, there was a lot of this cloak and dagger, coming up and whispering in your ear kind of thing. They never did that to me. Thankfully, the stuff they had to do to me, they had to come out into the light of a courtroom and a jury. But there's so many tentacles to the octopus and how many different ways that they can attack you. And I don't mean that to scare people, but that's why I try to encourage people to educate themselves. If you think it's bad that Lois Lerner orchestrated this campaign against conservative people, what about the fact that the income tax, as it's administered and enforced, it's a scam in the sense that most Americans aren't even required to pay the income tax. There's no statute that's ever been passed by Congress that makes you liable to pay the income tax.
And that's how they got it through without properly ratifying it, was for 30 years after, and this is all in the history books for those that don't know, they said, don't worry, it's not for the general public.
Exactly, and that's what kind of it always. We all have our pet peeve, but I so much wish that the American public, if you're mad that the IRS is attacking, your pro-life group or your pro-marriage group or whatever it might be, how about the fact that they're taking money out of your pockets illegally, and they've been lying to you since, since at least World War II, if not really all the way back to 1916, 3 years after the 16th Amendment. So the lies are so deep, but the biggest lie is you don't even owe the tax, and we're really paying it just out of, a gun to the head. And that's
what about the cliche that, we got to fund the government, it will collapse? You're an expert on this. Break that down.
Well, sadly, what people don't understand is, the Federal Reserve is much like a credit card advance. Most people probably understand that. If you take a $5,000 credit card advance because you qualify with your credit rating, they'll give you $5,000 in your account. And then as long as you pay the minimum payment every month, you're fine. If you stop making the minimum payment, then they'll get ugly with you. But, let's say, in the federal government's case, you have, $1 trillion cash advance you can take. And as long as you're making that minimum payment, you're fine. And of course, the bankers, what they want to make sure is happening is where does the government get the money to pay that minimum payment for the cash advance? They get it from you and me. And so the government doesn't care if they have to, frankly, it's easier to lie to you and get you to come forward and give them the money than it is for them to actually tell you the truth or just do it because, the law requires it and then enforce it. It's so much easier to lie to people, and that's what they've been doing for decades. And I'm just, part of my job, hopefully, is at least to infect the jury pool out there. There's still Americans that serve on juries. And we need them to wake up. And the next time that there's a tax allegation against some defendant, don't be so quick to accept that the government case that, this is another tax cheat. He doesn't want to pay his fair share. That's a load of crap. And people need to wake up to that and how deep the lies go. And, if they're going to, the other thing that got to me, Alex, I always thought, how can they be so brazen at taking our Second Amendment rights and our First Amendment rights? What do they think? And then I realized, if they can rip us off, take money out of our wallets via the income tax, and that's a scam that most Americans aren't even required to pay it in the first place, then sky's the limit. They can do anything, right?
That's right. And now, if they can arrest reporters for reporting on WikiLeaks and then ban them from talking to media while they're in federal prison, then the sky's the limit. I mean, that's the thing. We are so deep into this that I'm really worried about the next shoe to drop. I do see an awakening, but it's kind of like being awake while you're being burned at the stake or something, Joe. In your gut, where do you see all this going?
I see hope, and I also have great concern. America, Freedom to Fascism, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners have seen, but I always encourage people to get that film continue to be seen even by more people. Aaron Russo did an incredible thing for us before he departed this world. And
he made it with bladder cancer. He was in great pain while he made that movie.
That's right. So, watching films like America, Freedom to Fascism, realizing that people like myself or Kent Hovind or Alex Jones or anyone that's actually being attacked, they are your neighbor, okay? Just because your neighbor down the street isn't being attacked or you're not being attacked or your cousin isn't being attacked doesn't mean that people are being attacked by the IRS, by the federal government, being tripped up by these thousands of pages of regulations. And we need to speak up and speak out louder, and we really need is more numbers. We need more people.
Sure, but also, look, the IRS won't even answer calls or tell people how to comply with Obamacare as they prepare to start grabbing bank accounts and paychecks if you don't buy it, and then they lied and said they weren't going to do that. I mean, it's just the lying, too. I mean, how many lies do we have to buy from these people?
Well, again, that's why I encourage people to learn a little bit more about these tax laws. You don't have to be a tax attorney or a CPA to recognize the way that the IRS, like, for example, the 1099 situation. Most people know what a 1099 is, and they think, I paid someone over $600, therefore I need to issue them a 1099. Look at the regulations governing 1099s, and you'll see at a minimum, you may not even have to have a Social Security number put on the 1099, and you may not have to file a 1099 at all. And that's what the regulations say. Now, I recognize that the IRS will still try to enforce it as if these are requirements.
Well, it's indentured servitude. They're making you report on other people in what should just be an open transaction, which is prior restraint and is antithetical to a free society.
That's right. I mean, everybody knows we didn't have to live through World War II. We can read enough about it to know that it was citizens reporting on each other that enabled the tyrants to take over and keep control. So we've got the same issue going on here. Why are we reporting on each other? And why are we reporting to a tyrant? You know, it's one thing to tell somebody something about someone else, but when you're telling it to a tyrant, somebody with a known track record, as you say so often.
That's right. I mean, if I see some, absolutely. One time there was this grocery store, gas station that became a drug dealing operation, and they were obviously running all sorts of stuff out of there. It was really seedy and gross. So I did tell the Austin Police Department about it. I said, you obviously know this has been turned into a drug dealing brothel house right here off William Cannon, right by my house. I don't like it. And nothing was ever done. I'm just saying that was the local police I told about that, though. I would never call the IRS tyrants, even on my enemies, because then I would be complicit in the tyranny.
You're exactly right. And, you know, we have to recognize the IRS for what it is. It's a tool, okay? Individual IRS agents, a lot of them are probably, you know, good people, hardworking. But, of course, the thing that I fault them for is not, again, recognizing that if the agency is harming their fellow Americans, our fellow Americans, then they need to speak up about it. And what's been sad but not too surprising to me is how few IRS agents, you know, followed me out the door. And I don't mean to puff me up like I'm some, you know, great thing.
But you did lead. It was a pretty big group, but statistically very small. And a lot of those IRS agents are in prison right now.
Well, for example, Sherry Jackson. I mean, she paid a lot higher price than I've had to do, and of course that's why I don't like being called these names like hero and these things. I've had it pretty easy, especially when you think of how people have fought tyrannies and tyrants throughout the centuries. You know, what did I have to do? Go to court and prove my innocence? I've been very fortunate, but there are people that are still suffering even today, and you know, I know there's a lot on our plates in terms of keeping track of all the ways that the tyrant is inflicting harm on us. But we can't give up. As you've said, I'm not going anywhere. It sounds like you're not either. We have families, but then our families are getting in the fight, and that's all we can do.
Well, that's what's great is that your children and your wife, everybody supported you. So many people, like Wolfgang Halbig and others, you know, his family's not supporting him, and you know, he's still going forward, and it's just so crazy how corrupt it's gotten, and that a cop, because you know this goes on, but to watch this cop plant that taser on the guy he's just killed, that's why the cop's now going to go to prison, is because, you know, he could have said he was scared or thought he had a weapon or whatever, and he'd have got fired. Now he's going to go to prison because he would just cold-bloodedly kill somebody and then try to defame him by framing him. It makes my head spin.
Well, I'd like to remind everybody that, you know, the Constitution requires an oath that each federal employee, each worker, takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution, not their supervisor, not their agency, but the Constitution. So the founders, the Constitution designated each and every employee, each and every worker, that they had an obligation,
a watchdog,
to defend the Constitution. Correct. And when you have everyone policing themselves, how much safer is everyone when that's going on? But unfortunately, in this day and age, they'll take an oath to support and defend the Constitution and never having read the Constitution.
And then they'll go to Southern Poverty Law Center training where they actually demonize the Constitution and say, look out for people that talk about it, and you've sworn an oath to it.
Exactly. But isn't it kind of funny how it actually becomes, when they attack you, and this is something I've found grudgingly, is that when you get attacked, it actually gives you tremendous opportunities. When you were attacked by Piers Morgan, look what you turned that into.
We probably got 50 more stations out of that and incredible support. Absolutely. That's what I'm saying. Going through the fire, being persecuted, at least in my life, because of Providence or whatever, has only made us stronger each time. But then I see people they've killed, they've put in prison. That's why I'm exactly. I mean, if I get put in prison and tortured to death, yes, I'm going to be a hero, folks. And I don't want that to happen. If Joe was in prison right now, you could say he's a superhero. Like some of the other folks out there. But in a world of cowards, it is heroic to do what you've done, Joe. And you went against the peer pressure. And, you know, they have studies that show that physical valor is more common than moral valor under peer pressure. And it just takes a lot to go against that peer pressure. And if we had more people like you in the government, it wouldn't be so out of control corrupt. Joe Banister, I mean, just another example, my dad's uncle, he worked in super secret corrupt stuff and then said no to it and got out of it as an Army officer. I remember when I was a kid, you know, what he was like. And he told my dad all this stuff. I mean, but I mean, beyond that, the Army hit teams they've got in the U.S., you name it. I mean, the public is so naive. Joe Banister?
Well, yeah, Michael brought up a great point about compartmentalization. It was actually... You know, I was compartmentalized in the IRS, working in the criminal investigation division, compartmentalized away from the auditors and the collectors. But once you lift the veil off and you actually lift away the compartments and see the bigger picture, you can see how your particular tasks actually help the tyranny. So, you know, I would, again, encourage people to look at the bigger picture, see how you fit into it, and then you can make a better and more informed determination as to whether, you know, you're actually helping tyranny, you're actually helping to steal from your fellow Americans and take away their rights. Well, as you mentioned, Alex, you know, I've relatives in law enforcement. Two of my brothers are police officers, and one's a battalion chief firefighter. My youngest brother, Jeff, the San Jose police officer, he was just at a funeral last week for a San Jose police officer who was shot with a rifle, approaching basically a domestic disturbance call in San Jose. So, you know, I can see it from both sides, and all I can do is try to really encourage both the police and the public. You know, be professional, be calm.
Sure, society is degenerating. Every metric shows it. And George Soros wants us to have a war with police. What's your take on that?
Well, to resist that exact program, which is you're so right on to bring that up and let people know about it, so that we don't conduct ourselves and further that program. We need to resist it. Yeah,
they want us all to hate each other while the foreign banks loot us. I mean, it's real simple. I mean, it's like criminals will set a fire to rob a bank or to rob a warehouse to divert. They want a mini civil war to divert while they're robbing us. I mean, it's so elementary.
Exactly. And, you know, the police, we need the police but we need them to adhere to the Constitution and do their jobs and be polite and professional with the public. But by the same token, the public needs to, you know, be good citizens and act like a good citizen, so that the police can see the difference. Now, you're still going to encounter, you know, the tyrant cop, but don't think that applies to them all. I mean, the Banister boys are out there, and they're good guys, and they see what it's like, you know, what it's like to be a real cop and a good cop.
Absolutely. We're not going to play into the globalist civil war plan, or at least we're going to try not to. I will go. Here is the passive aerosol spraying program, Department of Energy, $5 billion a year. Here are the patents. They add it to the jet fuel. It aerosolizes. They say it's a global sunscreen program. The guy won the Nobel Prize in '92 for it. But they won't give us the details of what they're doing. They just admit it's happening. And people go, oh, we don't care about that. You know, 20,000 views on YouTube. But then if I just randomly, or one of my reporters does, calls it chemtrails and says, what's this? And it's just 5 million views and everybody talks about it. It's like Emergency Centers Establishment Act, Civilian Inmate Labor Camp Program, Rex 84, Cable Splicer. These are Miami Herald, congressional studies, videos of C-SPAN. I can prove they've built emergency relocation centers around the country. But if you go point it at some random building and say, we think there might be a guillotine in there. It'll have 50 million views. I won't do that. But I don't get why the public loves to either believe the government lies or the opposite, believe the most vague rumor. But then when you're giving them bona fide proof, they just will not look at it. Joe, have you seen that, or what would you call that paradox?
I have seen it, and I hope I'm not guilty of it myself, but what I try to encourage people to do is remember that as you educate yourself and become more aware, others aren't necessarily following along. And so it's so important so that you stay in tune with those people and you're able to communicate with them. You need to try to remember as best you can what it was like before you were awakened. And I'm not saying to just act like you're asleep, but continue to be calm and patient and, especially the patience. I had a family member, I might have said this to you once before, who was really angry with me when I left the IRS. And I just took it, and I didn't really get that upset about it. And it took a few years, but eventually that family member came to me and apologized without me saying anything about, I've come to realize why you did what you did and how dangerous the things have become. So that kind of illustrates to me how we have to just really muster the patience.
Sure.
And people will come around.
Well, I have a real estate lawyer. And I mean, I don't know him well, but I've just used him on a few, transactions. He's one of the top lawyers in Austin, and he's a former high-level state judge. And I mean, I've had conversations with him, and it sounds like he's, one of us, and the guy's a former Democrat. And then I ran into another high-level state judge, and the guy stops me. And I thought I recognized him. I went and looked him up later, and sure enough, it was him. And he stopped me in an office building, and he goes, I'm Judge such and such. I just want to say, I think you were nuts. But he goes, this IRS thing, targeting families, targeting groups, doing this. He goes, this is totalitarianism. You're absolutely right, and I apologize to you. But I mean, exactly. People who aren't criminals themselves just can't believe it's going on because they're compartmentalized in the system. But as this decompartmentalization happens, people are going to have that moment of truth. What does your gut tell you is going to happen, Joe Banister?
Well, I think there's going to be the critical mass is getting there, Alex. And it's as you've mentioned before, it's a sprint to the finish line, and it doesn't always get pretty near the finish line in terms of what the tyrants, they pull out the hats and the bats and the guns. We've seen this happen in the Middle East. We're doing everything we can to avoid that from happening. And I think you're so right how we can make these changes in a nonviolent manner. It can happen, but we need more people on board rowing the boat.
And it's a war of ideas. So many revolutions are successful when they're nonviolent. They're just not called a revolution later. That's one of the biggest psyops is how they brand revolution as violent when those hardly ever work because they want you to try what doesn't work or tends to bring in something worse when it's the velvet revolutions of ideas that happen, and it's called a renaissance. Remember when I was down there making a police state film in '99 covering Urban Warrior, which trained to confiscate guns in the Bay Area on record? Nobody was talking about it then. Now, at least, there's a national debate, Joe Banister.
Very much agreed, Alex. And I mean, even when I think back of how little of the pit that I saw and how much more you saw even back then, I think your conversation with the judge illustrates how it's so beneficial that you delve into so many different areas. And even myself, who focuses on taxation, but we need to make our presentation as wide as possible because you never know what line in the sand you're going to help someone cross. With the judge, it had to do with the IRS. But for someone else, when they see the arming of the police departments, that might be their line in the sand. So it's really important to, have a wide variety of topics because there's a wide variety of people out there, with their lines in the sand that they haven't crossed yet. But once you show them that key piece of information, all of a sudden they're with us.
And the globalists have done the math, and they know the military, number one, and police, number two, are some of the most awake people because they've been decompartmentalized, living it, that they're natural allies of local government and state government to take the country back. That's why they want a civil war. And I get a lot of criticism going, what's this butt kissing of the police? You're the guy that exposed the police state. Yeah, so the globalists couldn't take over the police. I tried to stop that. It didn't mean I hated the average cop. And, I mean, it's simple. George Soros wants a war on the police to drive them into the Fed's arms and fully complete their journey to the dark side. That's what's going on. What is your take on, should we water down what we're saying, Joe, or should we double down?
I think we should double down. Of course, I'm not running for office, but I think it's so important. I mean, Americans need to look at the track record of the Republican establishment. They talk about making heads roll. They put on a good performance there at these hearings. But what ends up happening? So do you want someone that's going to keep on saying, we're going to get you, and never do? Or do you want somebody that actually makes things happen?
Exactly. They've been coming after Rand Paul. That's why you know he's the good guy. Joe Banister, thank you so much. All right, let's go to our guest, Jerry Peterman. And I've had medical doctors, radiologists on so many, but he's the expert because he talks to all of them. FukishimaUpdateReport.com is probably the leading site, clearinghouse of real information to break this down. He's an engineer in TV and radio. And he also has the first microcomputer-powered he's just a very interesting engineer. I'm not going to get into all of it. And he works with production, scientific advances, and such other varied disciplines as communication, transportation, alternative fuels, environmental waste disposal, satellite-delivered electronic store shelf advertising, electrical power generation, anti-aging, food and science, wind turbine technologies, FukishimaUpdateReport.com. And he's got the people on the ground in California, people on the ground in Japan, and he joins us now. You heard my little intro, sir, but what do you make of the media and the government admitting, but saying it's the first time radiation has reached when they know that's not the case? And what are the real levels that we're seeing? Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Alex. I think the thing that's most obvious is this is very similar to Brave New World, where someone simply goes in and rewrites the news. That's what they're doing, is just, oh, that's not what we said, we're rewriting it. We're looking at off the coast of California and the rate of 7 becquerels of radiation per cubic meter of seawater, and that's quite a bit. It's not going to probably give you cancer immediately, but over a long period of time, you don't want to be eating fish in that condition. You just don't. I mean, it doesn't surprise me. It raised, when they first started detecting it in the air in April or May of 2011, they began to reduce or increase the amount that was acceptable. The U.S. Nuclear Agency began to increase that. So, it doesn't surprise me at all.
Break down your research, because it's so wide and so huge. What are the real experts saying?
Real experts saying we're in a world of hurt. We have something that is going to be around for the next several hundred generations. We're dealing with a runaway situation that no one knows how to deal with. I've written up something called Insane Things About Fukushima. And initially, everybody thought, oh, well, we'll have this contained in a year or two. We'll go in and contain the material and all this. And, oh, yeah, it's probably still in the containment vessel, all this different core material they call corium. It's a mixture of all the radionuclides in the plant. And truth of the matter is, nobody ever went into this thing and took a look at it. And now it's been 4 years since this, quote, accident. And now what? We have a situation where TEPCO's plant chief just in March made the statement that it's going to be a 200-year wait before we have technology that even begins to know what to do with this thing. We have no viable method to deal with it. And there's so many uncertainties. We just really consider the problems insurmountable. And this could be possibly the worst possible result. Centuries could pass. One another plant executive said centuries may pass before humans find a way to deal with these molten cores. We have no idea what to do. You see, the problem they're admitting now, after 4 years, the technology doesn't exist to deal with this. And so I was always a little bit in the dark as to what are we dealing with? How much material are we dealing with, and what is it? And we found that the reports now indicate that at least 5% of this is plutonium activated as MOX fuel. And MOX fuel was, some people say, illegally being used in there.
And that was the MOX 3 reactor that had the big mushroom cloud explosion. I was no engineer, but I looked at the online release designs and clearly said those are the rods being shot up through the air. And a year later, they admitted that they shot up to 2 miles away, but the government here and there covered it up. And so that's my big question. And before we walk through all this with the head of one of the leading organizations that's engaged in massive research, FukishimaUpdateReport.com, Jerry Peterman, why do the elites not seem to care? Why are they building more reactors? Why are they letting old ones rot and loading more fuel into them? I mean, it's almost like they want to kill everybody. I mean, what is wrong with the establishment?
I think we've, by the way, take a look at that very carefully. What is the color of hydrogen when it burns? Hydrogen is clear. It does not produce a yellow flash. The only thing that does produce a yellow flash in that kind of environment is some kind of nuclear conflagration.
And that's what Dr. Busby and other nuclear physicists have said here. And then, sure enough, universities outside of the government did the isotope test and said, yes, we show that fission occurred, correct?
That's correct. And now we have people, after we've got the admission that there was fission, now they're beginning to look, well, if there was fission, I'll bet we had some neutron radiation released. Oh, but we couldn't have had that because there was no fission. Well, we had fission. Okay, well, let's look for it. Well, they're finding that their estimate was 13 billion times lower than was actually released. In other words, there is 13 billion times more neutron radiation that's been released. And the significant part of that is that every particle of the wastewater that's stored on site has been subjected to neutron activation. And neutron activation is an interesting process. The radiation doesn't just go through the water. Every time a neutron hits a particle, let's say it's magnesium floating in the seawater, or iron, or copper, or whatever.
It's creating radioactive water.
Everything that it touches, a neutron touches, becomes radioactive. So you have got 144 million gallons of water stored on site, where every particle inside those containment vessels are radioactive.
And what is the half-life if this is plutonium radiation? I mean, we're not talking about cesium or something that breaks down in a few months, are we?
No, that's the neat thing about, and being facetious, the neat thing about nuclear power plants, they keep on giving. You can get the benefits of the pollution for a half-life of uranium is 4.2 billion years. So every time we create a nuclear power plant, we're creating a system that's going to produce waste that is going to last 4.2 billion years. Oh, that's the half-life. That means if it was 100 then, just using a number, in 4.2 billion years, it's going to be 50. So it
would take 8 billion plus years to become non-radioactive.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Yeah, it'd be beyond the end of the universe.
So what is the nuclear industry thinking? Because when I was a kid and everything, I bought into the propaganda. Hey, don't listen to the commies. Nuclear power is great. But then Russia has them melting down, blowing up, Chernobyl, the cancers increase. all these leaking reactors. CBS News says 75% are leaking. We have news articles from the Atomic Energy Agency, as you know, saying 90+% are leaking. It's like they had problems before, but suddenly it seems like the establishment thinks it's good. I mean, are they space aliens that want to make the Earth radioactive? Because I'm trying to be logical here.
You know, I don't think you're too far off. I'm not saying they're space aliens, but I will say something's not right. These people are certifiable. If you've got a car that's smoking going down the road, you'd think that probably at some point it's going to stop, and it throws out pollution all the time. You get these things leaking. The common sense thing to do is fix them and keep going if you're going to be in that industry.
Exactly. And of course, I don't think it's aliens either. I'm just saying they're so destructive that if they're not really aliens that want to live in a radioactive environment, this doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't make sense. You got to consider the premise of producing waste that lasts 4.5 billion years or 4.2 billion years just to create power for today. That really doesn't make sense either, but who's counting?
Sure, but I mean, if they could contain it even somewhat safely, but they just, 91% of the plants are leaking, and it's getting worse, and these plants are supposed to stay open 30 years. A lot of them are now into their 40th plus year. And of course, for folks that don't know, the radiation just eats these plants. They're falling apart. Whistleblower. I mean, in the old days, they would poison plant workers if they warned the public about a small leak. Nowadays, they just go, hey, we don't care.
We don't care. Now, I'll ask you a question. I bet you know this from your research. Where is the fuel stored, since we don't use Yucca Flats? Where is the fuel stored in the United States for reactors that spent fuel?
They're generally stored, I think, about 85% of the time, last time I saw, at the reactor sites.
Yes. And I can tell you for absolute certain that most reactors have more fuel stored at their locations than Fukushima had stored in their situations. Now, the chance of us having some kind of tsunami is probably not going to happen. But then again, we have several reactors in the Ohio Basin and out on California fault lines that are sitting on top of earthquake fault zones, which that took a lot of common sense to do.
I was going to ask you again. I've seen the global maps of where they store the stuff, whether it's the U.S., Japan, or even, well, they only seem to want to store them on earthquake lines. Is that a fun joke, or what's that?
I have no idea, but you have to wonder where it's stored now. We've dumped 40,000 tons of nuclear material, depleted uranium, and that term is not accurate. It's still 30% radioactive. We dumped that on Iraq and Afghanistan.
And don't forget the Navy, under orders for 30 years, dumped it all off the U.S. coast, both east and west.
Yeah, I don't think you have too much problem if you're down 10 or 15,000 feet in the ocean at the bottom. It's going to sit there for a while. But that really wasn't very bright either.
I shouldn't laugh. This is just crazy.
I mean, what can you do if you don't laugh in irony? What are you going to do? Cry about it? I mean, for God's sake, this is end of the world scenario for this thing. Alex, I did not know what amount of material we were dealing with in the molten cores. Let me tell you the size of a single molten core of the three. Those things are 30 to 47 feet across and 2 stories deep underneath each one of these. We're talking about something that is burning at 3,500 degrees, and it is the size of a small building. This is all one lump.
And update me on the specifics, because I saw the articles the last few months. They've been covering up leaks for 10 months. They say it's worse than ever at Fukushima. Absolutely,
it's worse than anything. And when you consider all 3 of these reactors, you're dealing with over 600,000 pounds of this material. And people say, "Well, that's a lot of pounds. I can't wrap my head around it." Okay, go out in a Walmart parking lot or someplace and count 190 cars, and that's the amount of material that you have melted down, the equivalent of 190 automobiles melted down.
Because they were storing it right on top of the reactors. Jerry Peterman, FukishimaUpdateReport.com is our guest. Where is all this going?
I hate to say it, but I think we're all, beer's cold and the game is on. Who the blank cares? We're so mesmerized by the media to watch Dancing with the Stars or, the latest Star Wars movie or whatever it is out there. I did a survey in Pflugerville at a nice mall, and I asked 100 people about Fukushima, and of the 100 people, 30 had heard about it, and of those 30, only 5 realized that it was of any consequence whatsoever. And one fellow told me it was really, really great because his friends all liked it, and I was a little taken back. I said, "Why?" And he said, "It's that new sushi place out on 183." Okay, I smiled and thanked him, and one lady blessed me out for not being very well educated since it was over with in 2010. So we have too many things that take our mind off of what we really should be doing, and frankly, I remember my father being upset with 5% federal income tax. What would he think now? And I don't think there's anybody left who will go out and demonstrate in the streets for anything because we're pretty well convinced that none of what we do matters anymore. And, children, if you ask children, they all think, grade school, basically junior high or high school, they think they're going to be dead anyway. Things are bad, and we've got people scared to the bone. What can you do when you're frightened? I gave a list, made a list of things that I felt like, what can we do? A few health things, not eat fish and stuff like that. But I said, one of the things about the average person buying a radiation detector, I don't think it's important to do that for one reason. They don't understand what they're looking at. But the main thing is, in the United States, we are fed so much fear that I think over the long run, fear is going to do more biological damage to us as a society than the radiation. And we're going to have, over the next 10 years, an estimate of 100,000 people die of cancer from Fukushima, an elevated rate. But I think fear is going to take its toll as well. Nobody knows how to measure that.
Well, Jerry, I think you've hit the nail on the head here. They've given us learned helplessness and terrified us over things like terrorism, where deer jumping out in front of your car kill more every year than that. So we're scared of all this stuff like great white sharks eating us. A statistic shows one of the biggest fears out there. But 5 people a year get killed by them. It's basically almost impossible out of 7.5 billion people to be killed by one. I mean, it's like finding a leprechaun. But people are scared of that. Meanwhile, real threats people can't seem to get focused on. No. And they just think you're trying to scare them like everything else because they feel powerless. But the truth is, we go through these times where it seems like nothing's happening, and suddenly there's a mass awakening and things change. The big problem is we have an elite that doesn't want the public to be active, so the elite can do whatever they want, and the elite themselves, I think, are so decadent that they become so megalomaniacal that they think they're invincible. And I think the radiation levels spiking and all the leaks is a symptom of the disease of an elite that have become so inbred and so decadent that a lot of their writings talk about, if we don't merge with machines and live forever, so what? Let's just blow the earth up. I mean, I think it's evil is what we're dealing with here.
I can't question that. Alex, I told you a long time ago that I felt like people who work for TEPCO or various companies like that are serving soulless entities. And it still comes down to the Supreme Court has declared that a corporation is a person and can spend whatever money it wants on boats and everything else. But if that is a person, there is no body, there's no physical entity there. So what we spiritually would say, there is no soul. So that means there's no conscience. And we are out there serving these companies, the people who are in the nuclear field are, and you're serving something that has no conscience. And it has got to be one of the scariest things on the planet. What else can you tell me that lasts 4.2 billion years that produces a waste? There's nothing on the planet.
I think you've hit it. That's it. We have produced people with all the food and all the liberty we have that are so decadent and so disconnected from the ground reality of the real world that they just don't care anymore about anybody but themselves. And I don't lionize the veterans, but people that have been in combat, people that have been through serious things, or aid workers that have been seen starving children, and folks like that, people who've had real suffering or seen it, they at least get wanting to save freedom and wanting to stand up for others and wanting to try to be honorable. Doesn't mean they're perfect. And that's why the system demonizes them, because they know veterans have actually been in the real world. And they want us all to be these insulated TV heads that aren't part of reality. And I think that's it. It's a world of spectators that now look at those of us that just want to build a future. I mean, ants save food for the winter. I'm not even saying we're special. We're just not trying to kill ourselves. And they're so divorced from life that they think we're the bad guys. Because, like you said, you had people chew you out going, that was over in 2010. That problem solved. When you went out, and it didn't even happen in 2010, you dumb woman. It's the arrogance of these people where their eyes glaze over and they smile and they have these dead shark eyes and they go, oh, yeah. It's like they revel in it. But I guarantee you start choking them, they're going to beg for the police and squeal and cry. It's like they're so self-centered that they don't have any nerve endings into the universe, is the way I describe them.
I totally agree, Alex. They're so disconnected that they don't realize that they're poisoning. I have a very close friend who said, don't these people realize that they're being affected by this material? He was referring to chemtrails and all the nuclear pollution and that kind of thing, Fukishima and all. Don't they realize that they're also being affected, and their children? And I said, I don't understand. I guess it's like the old whiskey ads that used to be in magazines that always had a skull painted somewhere in the ice cube or something, because those people who drank heavy liquor supposedly had a death wish. And it was a standard thing to put a skull somewhere in the ad. Maybe that's why it's called Skull and Bones. It's a death wish.
That's it. It's a metaphysical rule they've got to tell you.
Thank you for your work.
Well, thank you, sir. We're all just common sense trying to survive here. God bless you.